Hello, everyone, and welcome to the second of our three-part series, Grappling with Gauguin. This program is presented in parallel with our continued work on the Gauguin catalog raisonné, which you can find on our website, wpi.art. While the catalog raisonné presents the artist's work with data points about provenance and historical exhibitions, many of the critical discussions surrounding Gauguin in recent years have focused on his problematic persona and contemporary objections to his behavior and viewpoint. But how do these new perspectives impact the reception of art? Our goal with this series is to explore how Gauguin continues to factor into our cultural discourse, and specifically how curators and academics today are contending with the presentation of Gauguin's art. For today's talk, it is my honor to introduce Caroline Vercoe, who is joining us early in the morning from Auckland, New Zealand. Professor Vercoe teaches Global Art Histories and contemporary Māori and Pacific courses in art history at the University of Auckland. Aotearoa, am I saying that correctly, Caroline? Is it Aotearoa?
Aotearoa, yes.
Aotearoa, thank you. Aotearoa, New Zealand. She is the first Pacific woman to graduate with a PhD in art history from the University of Auckland. She specializes in contemporary Pacific art and performance art with a particular interest in issues of race, gender, and representation, and has been teaching, curating, and researching in these areas for over 25 years. She has published widely on Pacific artists' responses to Paul Gauguin's art, life, and legacy, with a particular focus on the last decade of his life in Tahiti and the Marquesas. So after Caroline gives her presentation, we will have time for a Q&A with the audience. So please prepare your questions and write them in the Q&A section at the bottom of the screen. And now I will turn the screen over to Caroline. Thank you, Caroline.
Thank you. Okay. Tēnā koutou katoa, talo whalawa, from Aotearoa, New Zealand. Thank you. I'd like to thank the Wildenstein-Plattner Institute for inviting me to reflect on the legacy of Paul Gauguin in the Pacific as part of their Grappling with Gauguin series. My presentation draws on just over a decade of research that focuses in particular on the ways that Gauguin's life and legacy has been responded to and critiqued by Indigenous Pacific artists and poets. My interest in the famous post-impressionist artist develops from a more circuitous route than many of my Gauguin research colleagues. As a point of departure, my point of departure is actually emerges from 20th and 21st century Indigenous responses to him, facilitated by an invitation to write for the catalogue of the exhibition Gauguin, An Elusive Paradise at the Seattle Art Museum in 2012. Discussing a wide range of responses to by Pacific artists, I'm going to unpack or attempt to unpack Gauguin's enduring legacy as what could be described as a pain point or platform, a provocation to consider why he seems so relevant a figure in debates, often ambivalent and polemical, even though he died some 120 years ago. While many may insist that Gauguin's paintings should be understood or looked at through a benign lens that takes into consideration his writing, family connections, and the prevailing socio-status quo and privilege of his time, his paintings have nevertheless fixed Pacific women into timeless exotic tropes. If, as has been suggested, every generation writes its own history, then the art, history, and legacy of Gauguin presents an intriguing, ambivalent, and increasingly fraught narrative across time and place. Contemporary artists in the Pacific have made works reflecting Gauguin's legacy here as a continuum of French colonialism and as a reflection of an art practice which, as I said, has entrenched stereotypes of Polynesian women as exotic and sexualized. And it is an ambivalent legacy that is drawn on, because on the one hand, his decision to leave his family in Europe and live out the last decade of his life in Polynesia, to live among he hoped fellow savages and engage in a range of marriages with young Tahitian and Marquesan women has fixed him as a colonial and sexual predator, especially as many believe that he had syphilis and infected many of his young wives with it, these very adolescents that he used as his exotic muses. In her collection of poems, Fast Talking PI refers to Pacific Islanders, New Zealand-born Samoan poet Selina Tusitala Marsh encapsulates this perception in Guys Like Gauguin. And I will just give you an insight into the first part of her poem.
Guys like Gauguin. 1. Thanks, Bougainville, for desiring I'm young, so guys like Gauguin could dream and dream, then take his syphilitic body downstream to the tropics to test his artistic hypothesis about how the uncivilized ripen like pawpaw, a best, slightly raw, delectably firm, dangling like golden prepubescent buds, seeding nymphomania for guys like Gauguin.
On the other hand, Gauguin remains a lucrative tourist commodity in Tahiti and the Marquesas. The Paul Gauguin luxury cruise ship cruises the Pacific all year round. It is staffed by Gauguinese, young Polynesian women who work as social hostesses, entertaining passengers, and no doubt embodying for many Gauguin's exotic version of Polynesia. The artist's paintings adorn Tahitian stamps, postcards, and murals in Papeete. I'm interested in the ways that artists like Gauguin have been framed, curated, read, reread, and looked at over time and place, and these interests and interventions show no signs of waning. But let's set the scene, for as we know, judgments of Gauguin's art are intrinsically linked to judgments of Gauguin the man. And there are many elements of his life that have been analysed and explored across a wide range of disciplinary lenses. Few artists can claim to have been interpreted through such a range of discursive lenses: symbolist, impressionist, synthesis, post-impressionist, fauvist, modernist, primitivist, orientalist, ethnographic, theological, feminist, post-colonial, decolonial, queer, and indigenous. Gauguin, the son of a Breton farmer and a French-Peruvian mother, who spent his formative years growing up in Peru, an experience which would be crucial in the development of his conflicted sense of self and other. Gauguin, who liked to think of himself as a descendant of the Incas. Gauguin, the Peruvian savage who loved to wear cowboy hats and was so impressed by Buffalo Bill and his Wild West show at the Paris World Fair in 1878 that he cut some arrows and went off to the beach to shoot them, just like Buffalo Bill. Gauguin, the descendant of French-Peruvian author Flora Tristan, an important utopian socialist feminist anarchist. Despite her death 4 years before the artist was born, he idolized her and is said to have taken copies of her books with him to Tahiti and the Marquesas. Gauguin, the most traveled European artist of the 19th century. Gauguin, whose mercurial character situated him into some of the most arguably volatile moments in 19th century art history, from his fraught and ill-fated relationship with Van Gogh in Arles, to the ambivalent position that he held in post-impressionist and symbolist circles, to his death in the Marquesas. Gauguin, the bad man who left his wife and young children in Europe to selfishly aspire to being a great artist in the South Seas. Gauguin the Bohemian, whose flamboyant character and cultural appropriation span the globe and who mined a myriad of diverse religious tropes and symbols. Remember that before he ventured across the ocean to Polynesia, he was dreaming up exotic landscapes and figures in Brittany, influenced by the palette and aesthetics of the ukiyo-e print masters Hiroshige and Hokusai. There is Gauguin, who is seen as a promiscuous syphilitic predator with a taste for exotic adolescents. Tahiti, Te Hamana, Pahura, Vaioho, Ana the Javanese. Gauguin, the loving father of his favorite daughter Arlene, named after his mother, who upon hearing of the news of her death in 1897, in a particularly harsh letter from Met, took arsenic and retired to the mountains of Tahiti to his fate. As we know, he didn't take enough to end his life and return to his studio to paint the now iconic "Where Do We Come From? Where Are We Going? Where Are We? What Are We?" on rough sackcloth. Gauguin, who, moving to the Marquesas, fought for his Marquesan neighbors against the Catholic authorities and local council, imploring them not to go to church. The well-read Gauguin, who wrote prolifically, and it would seem, despite the urging of his friends in Europe for him to stay in the Marquesas and die, was in fact, and securing his legacy as a great artist, was in fact planning a return to France, or was it Spain? After all, he was only in his 50s. Gauguin, rebellious to the last, held true to his bombastic nature and pugilistic personality, carving his outrageous bawdy erotic carvings, adorning his house of pleasures in Aotearoa. Gauguin's self-proclaimed suffering is expressed only a few days before his lonely death in Aotearoa. Writing to his friend Charles Maurice, he declares, "I'm down but not yet defeated. Is the Indian who smiles while being tortured defeated?" As we know, Gauguin has come to symbolize particular tropes for feminist, art historical, queer, and cultural theorists. So too have Pacific artists explored and developed concerns relating to gender, identity, politics, colonialism, geopolitics, decolonial, and post-colonial critique, coalescing around the figure of Paul Gauguin. For decades, contemporary Indigenous artists in the Pacific have been responding to his life, work, and legacy, reworking his paintings as, for instance, political protests against nuclear testing in Mururoa and Whangatofa. This painting was done in the 1980s. By the mid-90s, over 200 nuclear tests had been conducted by the French, dating from the mid-1960s to the mid-1990s. In the Tahitian artist's Andre Marere's painting Après, or After Paul Gauguin, the bowl of fruit held just beneath her breasts becomes a ground zero site. And this fusion of Gauguin's female figures with nuclear testing highlights two issues that resonates for many in the Pacific. The figure on the left side of the composition holds a banknote in place of the flower, the right side, suggesting a complicity of many Tahitians in the tourism industry and implicating those who enjoyed the short-term economic benefits due to the wealth that flooded into the islands as a result of the development of the nuclear economy. Tyler Vaiau, she's a New Zealand Samoan artist. Her art also engages with issues of representation, focusing on Gauguin's practice. Like many New Zealand-born Pacific artists, she is informed by post- and decolonial engagements. Her photographic series, D and Dallas do Gauguin, features the artist's sister and friend, their faces superimposed over a number of Gauguin's Tahitian paintings. The work's artifice immediately apparent, since the glossy photographic faces contrast Gauguin's textural brushstrokes. The works evoke amusement cutout murals in which visitors place their heads into holes and have their photos taken. They are also a reminder that for the most part, Gauguin's Polynesian subjects were real girls who sat for him. These images pose a question about the relationship between the various sitters and the artist. How might they have felt? What were the dynamics of their engagement? Unlike the vast majority of scholarly responses, which do not pay any real attention to this, for artists like Vercoe, it is a crucial part of her critique of Gauguin. While these images have come to represent the trope of the dusky maiden, their shared ancestral heritage with Polynesian artists and writers makes for a much more personal engagement. Unlike the Polynesian Eve or Mary that Gauguin often represented for his European audiences, for many Polynesian viewers, the female subjects suggest a friend or family member. Samoan Japanese artist Yuki Kihara also contemplates the legacy of Paul Gauguin's life and times in the Pacific, transporting his narrative to Samoa, her birthplace. Her series of black and white photographs taken in 1913 are titled after Gauguin's monumental "Where Do We Come From? Where Are We Going? What Are We?" places the artist in notable sites in the history of colonial occupation, as well as recent environmental disasters on the island of Samoa. Clothed in an austere black Victorian mourning dress, they contrast the postcard vistas of tropical beauty that we often associate with Polynesia. In one image, she is pictured at the center of a tranquil beach looking out to the ocean. The title, after tsunami Ngaluafi, Lalomano, refers to the place, which is the site that she is standing on, where there was a devastating earthquake and tsunami in 2009. In other images, she stands witness to these deserted settings that were very important in terms of colonial history, including a monument to the raising of the German flag in 1900. 3 decades on, Kihara literally brings many of Gauguin's painting scenes to life. In what she calls upcycling, inspired by, and this is a recent Facebook post, the Māori scholar Nahuia Te Awi Kōtuku, who she's talking to here in a city, place called Aotearoa, where there's a big Polynesian community. Te Awi Kōtuku in a publication suggested a what-if scenario in relation to Gauguin's subjects. She suggested that Gauguin could actually have been painting mahu, or third-gendered subjects. Adopting an intersectional approach, Kihara reworks the titles of Gauguin's paintings in a series called Paradise Camp, which were exhibited last year at the Venice Biennale when Kihara represented New Zealand. Drawing on hers, so here we can see she populates the familiar compositions of Gauguin with members of the Whawhawhine community in Samoa. Drawing on her earlier Where Are We Going series, she makes connections between Gauguin's axiomatic questions and important moments again in Samoan history, this time in relation to Indigenous queer sexuality and gender identities and issues of climate change. Patches of a Rainbow After Gauguin restages his famous work with members of the Alipata Whawhawhine Association. This district was heavily damaged in an earthquake and tsunami that I mentioned before in 2009, but here they are set in a lush tropical frame, reflecting resilience and the transformative power of nature. The artist also makes connections to the resilience of the Whawhawhine community, who are often the first to respond to natural disasters. Another work from this series, When Will You Marry After Gauguin, adopts a similar format to Tyler Vial's Dien Dallas du Gauguin, even though her intentions are very different. Rather than reimagining this famous painting as families and friends and exploring connections and affinities between the sitters, Kihara's artistic intervention features whawhawhine. Celine and Tyra she says, sitting as a pair in a state of dignified repose, which in part forms a personal subtext for the artist, the whawhawhine herself. I created this photograph, she explained, partly as my personal longing to find love without fear and discrimination. Māori artist Nephi Tupaias creates overlay painting styles, drawing on the famous forms of Gauguin's females. In contrast, she cloaks them with a Māori painting style called kōwhaiwhai, which represents symbolically genealogy, or in Māori it's called whakapapa, and mana, which is ancestral and spiritual power and authority, by covering up the female forms in Gauguin's paintings with striking coloured forms of Māori kōwhaiwhai. Tupaia also queers Gauguin's familiar forms, embedding them with a gender-fluid narrative to tell stories of her own experience and transition in life as takatapui, an all-embracing Māori term for fluid, non-binary gender identities, and more specifically, like whawhawhine, irawhiti or transgender, with connections across the Pacific to whawhawhine in Samoa, Leiti in Tonga, whakawhiwhine in Niue, and mahu in Tahiti and Hawaii, among many others. These identities do not only relate to gender, but also to their ancestry or whakapapa and lineages that connect them to their communities, the land, and the ancient Aotearoa ancestors. Tupaia has been exploring the practice of Gauguin for over 20 years. Gauguin's statuesque representations of Polynesian women and his innovative colour palette offered Tupaia a point of entry into exploring her own Māori painting practice. She chooses a particular kōwhaiwhai design called mango pare, which is inspired by the hammerhead shark. And what she does, and this is a symbol of strength, resilience, and agility, all crucial for the takatapui experience. In her painting, Cloak of Invisibility, she focuses on two figures taken from Gauguin work and transforms them into two takatapui figures, commanding their place in the world. The women are adorned in pink and blue that merges within the landscape. And this is done deliberately, she explains, as trans women and men have always lived in the shadows of the colonial system. The decorative dots each represent a star, a reminder of people who were forgotten. And she incorporates the colours into the rainbow flag, pink, white, and blue. Tupaia made the decision to train as a Māori painter around 2018 and developed her practice not only to explore her own whakapapa or genealogy, but also drawing on customary painting styles that are intimately connected to them. And this distinctive cursive design is actually inspired by the rafters of Whare Whakairo, or the carved meeting house. And if you just have a look at the ceiling areas, you can see these rafters with these distinctive cursive forms. Gauguin, however, was never far away, and Tupaia has drawn on his works as a framework to tell her own story, covering his now familiar forms with kōwhaiwhai and infusing them with her own personal narratives of trauma, healing, and resolution. This work, I lay with Kaitiaki are guardian figures, is the first of a series that describes the story of her excommunication from the Mormon church when she was in her late 20s for the transgression of being transgender. The painting, she explains, draws on Gauguin's manatupapo, but reframes the frightened young girl into a textured form of the artist herself, lying on a bed face down with both hands raised, and each side is an act of surrender. She is represented only by a silhouette. There is, however, a ghostly figure hovering over her, but unlike the tupapau, this figure represents her grandmother and is a form of guardian and protector. Another work, Whakarongo ki te tangi, or Listen to the Tears, is appropriates Gauguin's Nevermore work. And again, the kōwhaiwhai speaks of her personal journey, and she is embraced not only by these forms, but also by these suggestions of these ancestral figures of protection. The New Zealand Samoan artist, Graham Fletcher, has also employed painting practices of overlay as a loaded visual metaphor in relation to Gauguin's now iconic female forms. Of Samoan and European heritage, he has been exhibiting since the 1990s, and like Tupaia, his work incorporates complex subtexts that belie their aesthetic appeal. His Virgin's DPM series, an enamel on tapa work, appropriates female forms from Gauguin's paintings. Describing his art practice at this time as a camouflage aesthetic, he attempts to cover up the woman, to protect or hide them from his gaze. The Virgin paintings deliberately bring together all the pictorial cliches that have come to represent Polynesia, including images of lush tropical vegetation and flowers, along with the recognizable figure of the Polynesian temptress. Using an excessively colorful palette and thick layers of glossy enamel paint, Fletcher creates sumptuous painterly surfaces. He paints the female forms into his bright textured environments and then covers them up with his then signature patterns, which are derived from the military camouflage visual aesthetic. Gauguin has continued to be referenced in Fletcher's work beyond his patterned forms from the 2000s. From the 2000s and 10s, he has created these series of works under this broad umbrella term of lounge room tribalism that reflect a development of his into figurative practices. Characteristically, we see large-scale paintings set within domestic interiors that seem to have been lifted straight from the 1950s or 60s design magazines. And yet here, within this familiar, if not retro context, is a work by Gauguin, casually hanging on the wall. For some artists, Gauguin's legacy is fraught and ambivalent. However, for others, like Tupaia, it is a space of empathy, agency, and belonging. While she also looks to Gauguin as a point of departure, and like Fletcher covers the now familiar female forms, her intentions are very different. Tupaia has used Gauguin's paintings as vehicles to present and process her own transitions in life. Fletcher's overlay reflects a desire to lure his viewers into his works through his use of color, all designed to veil and disguise the larger meanings just lying beneath the surface. So I just have some concluding comments now. While Gauguin railed against the artifice and civilization of Europe, it seems he still dreamt of return. My flight may be a defeat, he wrote, but my return will be a triumph. By the end of his life, perhaps that return that he longed for became aligned with his quest to be remembered as a great artist. This goal would demonstrate and long last his worth as a father, after all, his legacy to his children, as well as secure his place in art history's canon. His move from Brittany to Paris to Tahiti to Aotearoa and the Marquesas represents stages in the development of his art practice, which interestingly he equated to different fragrances. And that, of course, was the famous inspiration of Noa Noa, his publication that he defined as very fragrant. That's how he defined the term. He writes, "My Brittany canvases become rosewater because of Tahiti. Tahiti will become eau de cologne because of the Marquesas." While he sought to reject and challenge the French Academy and its traditions, he also followed reviews and critiques of his work very closely, was a collector of art, and actively engaged with art dealers and agents right up until his death, negotiating sales of his work and urging them to market it. Writing in the Marquesas in 1903, the year of his death, Gauguin muses, "I believe that life has no meaning unless one lives it with a will, at least to the limit of one's will. Virtue, good, evil are nothing but words unless one takes them apart in order to build something with them. They do not win their true meaning until one knows how to apply them." If Gauguin is indeed a savage boundary rider, living amongst the natives in the middle of an exotic, tropical, timeless nowhere, then the place and the people also needed to reflect these requirements. And he used his primitivist and Orientalist mindset to create them in his paintings for a European art market whose respect he longed for. Papeete was, as we know, too civilized for his taste, and so he was said to have been driven around the island, entourage in tow, to find that lost imagined world. When this too became too familiar, he moves to the Marquesas, home of the savage tattooed cannibals, as he called them. But alas, Gauguin was several centuries too late. In fact, his encounters with the primal other that he so yearned for to fuel his art practice and assuage his savage within, to make him a great artist, quite probably were just as much of a figment of his imagination as the odalisque of Ingres's harem. Gauguin has become a kind of mythical figure for many, ironically representing polarized and polemical positions in relation to artistic creativity, adventure and freedom, colonial fantasy, sexual exploitation and disease. Always the other to himself, his writing and body of work demonstrates an engagement with alterity, or the state of being other and different, that is personal and intertwined. For more than the Orientalist dream and representation of the other, often distanced or constructed as a kind of a ballast or binary, Gauguin's life and death in Polynesia situates him into a different kind of critical discourse. And in the Pacific, these legacies remain and continue to provide rich points of departure for Indigenous artists, reworking and reconsidering them. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Carolyn. You've given us a lot to think about. For those of you who are online, please put your questions in the Q&A. I do have some questions for you, which is, it strikes me particularly in looking at Tupaya's work, if I'm pronouncing her name correctly. It's not so much, I think a lot of people think perhaps rashly that there is this cancel culture with Gauguin. And it seems to me that there isn't, particularly with some of the artists that you focused on. They're looking at Gauguin's work as a point of inspiration and, as you say, as a point of departure in understanding their own life experiences and as a great source of creative fodder. And I'm just wondering if you can address this idea of people thinking that Gauguin should be canceled. Is that something that artists in Polynesia are really doing? It doesn't seem like it from your presentation.
Well, I think that this is something that I'm really interested in myself. I think there's this real spectrum of artists responding to Gauguin, and there certainly is the cancel culture element to it. Or if it's not cancel culture, the use of Gauguin in particular as this loaded symbol to address the ways that art history has fixed Pacific people and communities, not only bodies into these stereotypes that are still fueled today through tourism, but also the place of the Pacific is this timeless kind of place where people can go on holidays, so they're using Gauguin. So my understanding of cancel culture is that they just want them to vanish, but the thing with Gauguin and there are other figures that take their place as very significant in colonial histories, like Captain James Cook, that a lot of contemporary artists use as a point of departure. Now, what really interested me about Nephi Tupaia, who I have known for many years, and I have the privilege of being able to have quite robust discussions with these artists about why they're so interested in Gauguin. And as I said, my own research really was prompted by an invitation. It wasn't like, oh, I would love to do that, so I'm curious myself about this. And so all of the ideas that Yuki Kihara as Whawhawhine artist explores, she talks about, and she's a very successful, globally acknowledged artist, the poison of art history, and interestingly enough, as part of Paradise Camp, she had herself prosthetically transformed into Gauguin and interviewed him. She, so there was this but she has a very critical take on his legacy. Tupaia, for instance, sees him as a great artist. She's Takatapu herself. She has lived through a lot of hugely challenging moments across a whole range of different things. But according to her, she's like, oh, well, I still think he's a great artist. I think she's so inspired by his work, but she's also using it as this kind of way of developing her practice. The only examples of cancel culture that I think are cancel culture as we think about it is that there are some critiques, or there have been some critiques by writers in Tahiti and the Marquesas about why is it that artists in Aotearoa New Zealand are often having the platform to critique Gauguin as opposed to those in French Polynesia. Do you know what I mean? So it's this kind of story sovereignty, if anything, about, why is it that, in Aotearoa, we have such a lot of artists who are acknowledged for their references to Gauguin, as opposed to those actually living in the place. But, it is, as you say, a very complex legacy that he leaves, and a very rich one.
For sure. It also, in the first part of your presentation, when you were showing how his art had been appropriated by Polynesian culture for commercial purposes, it was this kind of like full circle of appropriation. And it almost seems as if Gauguin is fading into the background as some type of just stylistic trope of Polynesian culture, whereas a lot of these more contemporary artists are bringing him out into the fore in their own work and remembering him in a way, which I thought was an interesting perspective.
And I also think because Gauguin is such a familiar artist within the Western art historical canon, that immediately people can understand the critiques or can understand that there's something being reworked here. But certainly also, in my little story about Gauguin, there are so many aspects of Gauguin's life and things that are still being uncovered. Recently the Courtauld acquired the Mountain Apri Journal, so it's now available digitally, and we're seeing a lot of his journalistic entries, which again show him as this very kind of there's very sexist sentiment in there, and it just kind of keeps fueling. I think we're still discovering new elements of his work, and the story of how when he passed away, a lot of his work being thrown into the well. I don't know if you're familiar, and then they had to kind of there's just so many the famous valuable "When Will You Marry?" He died in very impoverished state by all accounts, so there is this real kind of ambivalence and to the way his work is so valuable today, and the life that he led, in the late 19th century.
Absolutely. I have a couple of questions here that I'm just going to read through. One of them is, could you speak of Gauguin's relationship to Oceania, the Oceania objects he collected? We know much more about the avant-garde artists collecting African art, but much less about artists collecting Oceanian art. Any thoughts as to why?
Well, I think that probably the African art would have been more available. You know, if you think of Picasso and Braque, because of the colonial legacies around slavery and you know, the flood of African art. So I think Gauguin was, you know, as we know, was also a collector. Some have tried to champion him as a early anthropologist or ethnographer. I think the surrealist artists like Breton collected oceanic art. I think it was a different kind of dialogue in terms of how it was thought in relation to the whole primitivist framework, because of the different kinds of colonial histories that were experienced. Mm-hmm. But I think that a lot of Gauguin's Pacific collections certainly influenced his work, but I also think one of the most important things that I am really interested in is Gauguin's postcard collection. He's apparently had this massive postcard collection, and on the one time I've been to Tahiti, I went to the Gauguin Museum, and you know, there's no Gauguin works there, but there is this huge paintings postcard collection. So he was a collector, and like mind all these cultural references in his paintings. But yeah, I think that there are different kind of colonial legacies which lead to different collective practices in relation to oceanic and African sculptures. And it's a good question, but I think that the whole proliferation of African works were much more because of the histories of slavery. Yeah,
absolutely. Thank you. Okay, another question. Are there any plans for a large-scale exhibition that incorporate the works by some of these contemporary artists you've spoken about today? Perhaps in the context and discourse with Gauguin's own works, it would be fascinating to be able to view them all together.
I agree. I absolutely agree. There have been, and I believe that the next webinar there will be an artist Angela Tiatia, who was involved in this. But what generally happens, that is a very good question, is that they have the Gauguin show, it's all curated, and then they ask the Indigenous Pacific person in to kind of narrate aspects of it and often to write a catalogue essay. So for instance, the one that I wrote, there weren't any contemporary art, but I wrote the kind of ad at the end chapter to let people know about this. But I agree, I think it would be really interesting, and I think that it would actually, if there was a range, you know, if the curatorial premise was about the range of Indigenous responses as opposed to reactions to a particular premise that comes from Gauguin's work. Because the other point that I want to make is that when I talk to artists, a lot of artists, and Kihara may be an exception, very few of them are all that interested in knowing that much about Gauguin. They're like, ooh, you know, like he really is about the trope that he represents. Yeah. So I think that it would be really fascinating to see that. And I think that it would actually provide much more effective rethinking of Gauguin's legacy by seeing these works, because I only showed you a few of them. There are many more artists that have made works on Gauguin as part of a practice that looks at colonial legacies of Pacific cultural stereotypes. Yeah.
Now, I have a question here. It's a very heated question from someone who is upset. I'm pretty saddened and shocked by what I am hearing. An intentional assassination of this wonderful artist, judging him by today's standards and laws. You've laid the groundwork for canceling him, something we mentioned before, as that is missing. All that is missing is a Nazi bonfire to burn his works. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, no,
People
and I
get
think
upset
I'm
by
very
it.
yeah, I understand that. One issue that I have with the point of departure that suggests that this was all okay and normative in the time is that it may have been okay and normal for Gauguin, but it certainly was not okay and normative for other people in those communities. And what we are seeing is when history is written that only privileges a point of view and a position that highlights a certain way of thinking, then what we do in the present, and this is what I say, every generation writes its own history. Feminists have been doing this for decades now. I agree with you that cancel culture can be very destructive, but I don't see this as cancel culture. And I also think that looking at the spectrum of works, it's very, very important. We will never find any kind of resolution within our communities today if we keep on having this break with the past as, well, that was just how it was back then. It may have been for Gauguin. It certainly wasn't for those young women. And what we can do is we can break cycles of representation, and we can actually change culture by reconsidering it. I've had a lot of conversations like this. It is very heated, and I know that people feel very, very connected to his paintings. Many of them are beautiful works, and my research isn't trying to deny that, but what it is trying to do is to suggest that there are other ways of looking at his work. And in fact, many of the so-called great artists become great because of the ambivalent, the fraught, the polemical nature of their practices. I think Gauguin himself was aware of that, and a lot of his writings suggest that. And his relationships with Van Gogh, for instance, and many of his contemporaries suggest that he was this figure that not just today, but back in his own time, people were wanting to cancel him. If you think of Pizarro, so it is. I think that this is what makes art history. Certainly teaching it for myself for so long now, it makes me feel kind of hopeful, and I think that if anything, it will secure our the continuum of art history if we are able to let people come in and have their position and their say, because it will never. Gauguin's work will never be diminished. Look how valuable it is today. If anything, it's giving it oxygen. But I do acknowledge your position. But certainly it is not my intention to create a platform for cancel culture. And if you can see from the artists themselves, many of them have different views. And, cultural stereotypes have been very damaging within the Pacific. We have to acknowledge that. And many of these stereotypes were built not only from Gauguin, they stretch right back to some of Bougainville's talk, describing Tahiti as New Cythera, the home of Apollo. All of these still play a part in our histories today. But thank you for putting that question into the comments, because it's meant that we can open up the discussion, and I think it's time to do that for everybody's points of view.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for that. Here's a question. I forgot which anthropologist said this, but he said it seemed impossible for Europeans who encountered many different populations through discovery voyages in the 17th and 18th centuries to depict indigenous people other than on a mythological or antique mode. They could not think of new visual ways to represent differences. Do you think Gauguin's vision of Oceania is inherently different than that of his predecessors?
That's a really good question. I think that the neoclassical, the pervasive neoclassical style in Europe and the West in the late 1700s into the 1800s was a factor in the ways that Polynesian people were represented, because, and also, there's so much written about this within an anthropological discourse. Again, even things around like skin color. the way that many Polynesians are, of a kind of a mid, not black, not white, brown. They were kind of seen as this very exotic sexualized bodies. And the other thing around these early anthropological drawings and illustrations, and even the discourse of anthropology today, is that they kind of come and go. They might stay for a while, but the thing with Gauguin that I think makes him this very enduring figure in the Pacific is that he lived in the Pacific for a long time, almost a decade, the last periods of his life. He's buried in the Pacific. His physical remains are in the Pacific. And for us, it's it's almost like a responsibility. Like, it's like, that is a huge connection, because a lot of Indigenous cultures, your notion of place is often aligned to your ancestral lineages. And that's why I also think James Cook, Captain Cook, is such a dominant, enduring figure as well, because he too died in the Pacific, and his physical remains, many of them, are still here. And so I do think that Gauguin is different. But I think that he's part of this continuum. And I also think that he was very well read, and, as we know, kind of has this kind of meta narrative going through, where he's drawing on all these different anthropological and fictional things and creating this it's almost like a world making practice almost. So yeah, I think it is part of this, but I think that he blends much a different kind of practice around representing the Pacific to anthropological references. And we also have to think about his great aversion to the missionaries as well. Like, there's so much, but yeah, I think you're right. But I also think in the Pacific, the fact that he was there for such a long time, and his descendants, he has descendants in Tahiti and the Marquesas as well. So that actually creates a different kind of connection to anthropological references as such. Yeah.
Okay, great. If there are any more questions, we have just a few minutes. Let me just see if here's one. I'll read this one. Were French laws as oppressive in Tahiti as they were in other French Pacific colonies? I'm thinking about religious practices and modes of dress or nudity.
Well, French, there was certainly the Catholic missionaries that were in Tahiti. I think so. I think that there was, you can see that in some of Gauguin's paintings, where the female figures are wearing those big mu'umu'u dresses. I think that, yeah, I mean, the whole colonial experience differed across the Pacific. As we know, we have in the Eastern Polynesia, which was colonized, by the French. We have Western Polynesia, which colonized largely by the British, and then, the New Zealanders as part of that colonial administration, the Germans. So I think that there were definite restrictions, which would have affected dress. And so many of Gauguin's kind of nudes would have been, inspired by the art historical tradition of the nude as such. But yeah, I think so. I think that there was, by that stage, a very pervasive colonial influence, but also settlement. And remember, he arrived there and was bitterly disappointed, because it wasn't what he thought it was going to be. And that was because of the big French administration. But in saying that, apparently he always lived within some kind of vicinity to the post office. He had his wine, his absinthe, and, his sunflower seeds flown in from Europe. He grew his garden. So he kind of benefited from that, whilst also creating this, his works, which reflected his symbolist and Orientalist, I think, concerns.
Certainly, that's something that I think a lot of casual observers of Gauguin's Tahitian works don't realize, that what he was seeing was not necessarily what he was painting, and there were certain lot of elements of fantasy and liberties taken in his depiction of a lot of these models. I wonder, though, as the legend and fame of Gauguin grew and developed, was there ever a time that the Tahitian culture decided to take on some of these? I mean, certainly in the publicity that you showed, but was there a kind of an adaptation of his fantasy within their own self-presentations in fashion, perhaps, as the century went on?
That's a really good question. I have a colleague who was born in Tahiti, and she works at the Musée de Tahiti, and she did her PhD with us. And she's often, when she came, she was really bemused at why so many of our artists were referencing Gauguin, because she was like, it's just normal in Tahiti now, no one is that fussed, although that, that could be changing now. She's like, oh, it's just all you identity artists in Aotearoa that are so, engaged in this. And I think, but I also think that, I believe one of his grandsons is an artist over there. Like there are, the tourist industry often revolves around Gauguin. And there are a few, I believe that there are a set of wooden spoons that he made that are owned by the Gauguin Museum. So there are still some, kind of works or artifacts that he created. But I don't necessarily think, or that I can find, though Andre Marere was important. There's also a German artist that has lived in Tahiti for over 20 years called Andreas Detloff. He has created a huge series of works around Gauguin, but because I was just looking at the Indigenous artists, I didn't talk about him today. But I think everybody has just kind of got on with their lives, and it's not, it's like a lot of the artists here using him, but then they are seeing him more as a symbol of something. That, and a lot of Indigenous artists, a lot of, you see this African American artists rework representations to try and think about new ways of understanding them, challenge their dominant narratives. And they do this through very similar feminist artists as well, changing the bodies, reworking certain frameworks, and it is a very effective visual strategy.
Oh, well, thank you. Thank you so much, Caroline. This was a really thought-provoking presentation and introduced me to a lot of artists that I'm going to now look into. So this is really enriching for me personally. Thank you very, very much. For everyone else, please join us next week on Wednesday, November 8th at 3 p.m. Eastern Time, or 7 a.m. if you're in New Zealand, for our final episode of the series, with another global discussion featuring curator Anna Karsgaard from Copenhagen, the artist Angela Tiatia, and Patricia O'Brien from Australian National University College of Asia and the Pacific. That will be more of a conversation, panel discussion. I hope you can attend, and thank you all very, very much for joining us today. This is being recorded, so you'll be able to see it on YouTube for anybody, and access it through our website for anyone who didn't catch the live presentation. Thanks so much.